Can everyone see me? Ladies and gentlemen, Shakaijin and Salaryman, welcome back to another episode of Bento Bureau, the show about Japan from an international perspective. I'm your host, Basim Hijazi, and with me as always are my fellow favorite co-hosts. Let's start with Bastian Harth. How are you doing,
Hello, everyone. Yeah, very good. I'm so happy to be back on the show. Can't wait to start this off with a very special guest today, so I'm very excited.
And tuning in from Sweden and based and coming from Vietnam is Long Nguyen, our creative coconut. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. It's sunny today, finally, after so many days of raining. And today I can dress up. You made me dress up.
It's always sunny where I'm at right now, but you know, it's been an exceptionally bleak few weeks, hasn't it? I think, you know, I think when I'm going on the internet all the time, I'm starting to develop an addiction to information because every time I open my news feed, there's just all kinds of crazy things going on in the world, you know, movements against discrimination and injustice, that ripple effect spreading to all sorts of communities with the crackdowns on, you know, sexual misconduct, corruption, and, you know, other terrible things happening. So even though it's a sunny day, I can't help but feel it's a bit bleak. Maybe I should go on an information diet, you know what I mean? Social media giants getting hacked. Did you hear about that Twitter thing?
Oh, yes, I heard about that. I found that quite interesting, to be honest.
Strange times we're living in 2020, but of course there's the persistent concern of the coronavirus as well. I know that Japan has recently faced a spike of over 250 cases, I believe, maybe higher than that. And there was also a report, a worldwide report I read somewhere when it was about like 1 million cases reported in the span of 100 hours. It's like a record broken. What do you guys think about, you know, the current state of things where you're tuning in from?
From my side, to be honest, everything has kind of gone back to normality. People are going out again. I think people are not caring so much about social distancing anymore. Masks are still required in public transportation, that's for sure. And we're looking at other countries as well. Like we're looking particularly at Japan and South Korea, because Japan is doing extremely well when it comes to kind of testing a small specific group of people. So when
we can't hear you,
then
Bash.
test.
Okay. We can hear you now.
Right.
Long, maybe you can jump in here before we introduce our guest, just to speed things up.
Now I'm back.
Yeah.
I mean, in Sweden, the trend is kind of going down, back to normal. We have, I think, the number of deaths as well as the number of cases been reduced, been going down steadily. So I hope this trend continues.
Yeah.
And go back to normal next semester. Hopefully, half normal is okay.
To the audience, how's it been from your side? What have you been observing in your country, on the internet? How have you been feeling? Let us know. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce today's guest, Professor Thomas Blackwood. He teaches sociology and social psychology at Tokyo International University in Japan. He graduated with a Ph.D. in sociology and social psychology, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor. From the University of Michigan back in 2005, and also a major. You majored in social psychology, and you also have an MA in Japanese Studies and a BA in East Asian Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. How are you doing, Professor? Thank you for joining us.
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me. It's good to see you guys.
Great to see you too. You know, you've conducted multiple studies on Japanese society. You know, you've lived decades in the country, and we're looking forward to discuss more of those in detail today. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor, you know, as someone who's been taught by you in the past as well. It's great to have you on the show. You've helped us with this before behind the scenes. But, you know, maybe I'll start off by asking, as an educator who's working from home, how's that lifestyle been treating you for the past few months? Do you feel positive about teaching from the screen?
I don't think anybody really feels positive about teaching from the screen. I think the consensus is that we all want to be back in the classroom and interacting with the students. Frankly, teaching online remotely is exhausting because a lot of our communication relies on nonverbal body language and things like that, and it's really hard to get a sense of whether or not students are following along. If you have a class of 100 students, whatever platform you're using, you can't really see the expressions. And so using a lot more cognitive energy than normally to teach a class. And so at the end of every 90-minute class, I'm just exhausted. And I think that's the consensus, generally speaking. Nobody likes.
You mentioned something very interesting to me in our brief discussion last week, where you mentioned how, you know, what EdTech really needs to figure out is something regarding, you know, eye contact, right? I thought that was really interesting. I never heard that from anyone before. I work with a lot of, you know, people in education and EdTech, and that's the first time someone's expressed, you know, the importance of having eye contact, if we can figure that out in the digital space.
Somebody needs to figure out how to put a camera, how to configure the camera so that it looks like it's right behind the eyeballs of the person that you're looking at.
That's a very good point, right? You kind of always look at the screen when you're talking to someone, but then your eyes are not focused actually on the camera. So it's a skill to have, and particularly if in a meeting like that. Like with social interaction, eye contact is so important, right? It's kind of, it shows one is listening, one is paying attention, but that's impossible here, really.
Yeah. I mean, even right now, I'm looking up at the screen, and, you know, there's even that kind of strange feeling of, you know, where exactly am I looking? Am I perhaps reading from a script? You can never tell, right? Like, so, I mean, I do agree, even not just for education, but even other things like just doing the show in general. We need to find a way to try and, you know, reintroduce looking into the camera, because I can look into the camera right now, but then I can't see you. So it's a bit of a struggle switching back and forth. But
it becomes somewhat artificial because, right, you're either looking at the person that you're talking to, or you're looking at the camera, in which case you can't see the person. And so I think that's what people in broadcasting learn, that they have to pretend that they're talking to the camera, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's helpful they have the teleprompter as well, if they're reading from a script. But, you know, Professor, let's take it back a little bit. Why did you decide to pursue the field of sociology growing up? Tell the audience a bit about yourself in terms of that, you know. What brought you to Japan and to focus on Japan in the first place?
Wow, how much time do we have? I grew up in rural northeastern America. I grew up in a state called New Hampshire, which is a small state. It's not very diverse. It's not very exciting. I guess it's beautiful, and there's lots of nice people. But I was kind of bored when I was in high school, and I used to get into trouble because of being bored. And so my guidance counselor told me about a scholarship to spend the summer in Japan. And I applied for the scholarship, and I got it. And so I came to Japan in 1986, so now 34 years ago, and everything was different. And so I decided that I wanted to study Japanese when I went to college, and I started studying Japanese. And then I majored in East Asian languages and civilizations, just because I was still fascinated by it. And then I graduated in 91. Spent a couple of years in Japan as a salaryman, and then a couple of years in New York as a salaryman, and then I went to graduate school. So I went to graduate school 6 years after I graduated from undergrad.
That's
and
great.
Then I went to... Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. So I usually introduce the show as a joke, saying shakaijin and salarymen, but you know, it's great to actually have someone who's been a salaryman in the past. What's that like? You know, just very briefly, maybe like, what's that experience like? I assume it wasn't a positive experience since you've moved on to new things, but
it's hard. I don't want to be too critical, but it was boring for me. You know, it was I really fit this model of, if you look at Ronald Doerr's, Ronald Doerr is an academic who studied Japanese companies and Western companies, and even though I'm now fluent in Japanese and I know a lot about Japan, there's still, the ideas and the norms that I grew up with, which are, you know, you find a career and you identify with the career, the occupation, and not with the organization. And so because of where I grew up and because of what I wanted to do with my life, I was not satisfied just to work for a major corporation. I didn't care about the name of the company that was on my business card. I wanted to do something that was more interesting intrinsically to me. And so I was never happy, although many people do find happiness in that kind of situation. There's stability, there's, you know, the salary is, well, the salary is not very good at first, but it's stable and it's a long-term career option. And I just wasn't satisfied. I found no joy in working for a large corporation doing something that I was never really interested in. And so, but before I went to graduate school, I decided I wanted to try working in America because I only worked full-time in Japan. And so then I ended up working for Japanese companies in New York City, and I found a lack of satisfaction there as well for several reasons, but one of which was that local hirees at Japanese companies, and I think this is pretty much around the world even today, don't really have chances of moving up very high within the corporation. The executives within Japanese corporations that are located tend to be people who are sent from the headquarters to be there for several years before going back to the headquarters. So I didn't really see any future. Yet, if you realize my background was only in East Asian languages and civilizations and only working for Japanese companies, I didn't really have, I had a hard time finding work outside of Japanese corporations. So after 5-6 years of doing this, I realized that what I really wanted to do was to teach. And so I decided to go to graduate school. And I was in graduate school at Michigan getting my master's degree in Japanese studies. And I was speaking to my advisor, and my advisor told me, you won't be able to get a university teaching job with just a master's degree. And so that's the first time I started thinking about what I can get my Ph.D. in. And I didn't major in sociology as an undergraduate, but one of my favorite courses outside of my major as an undergraduate was sociology. A sociology course taught by William Julius Wilson, who is a famous scholar of inequality and race in the United States. And I really enjoyed that course, and so I decided to try my hand at sociology. I was able to get into the sociology program at the University of Michigan. And as you mentioned, my major was social psychology, but at Michigan, when you take your comprehensive exams or the exams for the master's degree, you have to pick an area. And of all the different courses that I liked social psychology the most. And so I did get a master's degree in sociology, but the field within sociology was social psychology. And then after that, I came, because I had majored in Japanese studies, I got my first master's degree in Japanese studies. I was an undergraduate in Japanese studies, and I knew that for my PhD dissertation, I wanted to study Japanese society. So I had the disciplinary background in sociology, and I decided to come back to Japan to study about Japanese society. And that brought me up to my dissertation research, which happened from 2001 to 2005. I was also working full-time in Japan from 2003. So 2001 to 2003 was really full-time PhD research. From 2003, I started working full-time at a Japanese university.
So, Professor, how did you combine those bachelor and master degrees into your PhD in the end? What was your dissertation about?
I studied high school baseball in Japan. Is basically the educational aspects of extracurricular activities in Japanese high schools. And yeah. What would you like to know something about it?
Yeah, that would be nice to hear a little bit about it.
Most Japanese students join extracurricular clubs in middle school, and they enormous amount of time in the clubs. The baseball might appear to be extreme, but it's actually quite representative of sports clubs in general, but they basically practice anywhere from 3 to 5 hours a day, usually at least 6 days a week. And so over the year, and usually maybe 1 or 2 or 3 days off over the period of a year. for the entire period of their high school career. So it's an enormous amount of time investment. And Japanese high schools and middle schools justify this by calling it a part of education. So it's educational. The expression is kyoiku no ikkan. And so I wanted to see, first of all, if it was educational, and secondly, if it is educational, what are people learning? And so I did ethnographic qualitative research on high school baseball teams, and came up, after doing my research, I came up with different concepts or different ideas of things that people believe they're learning through extracurricular club activities, through baseball, and I categorized them into character and interpersonal relationships. So character included things like greeting, I guess, actually, so manners and greetings and how to be polite, how to deal with seniors or juniors, a lot of these different things that they talked about learning. And so I published my dissertation based on that research and pointed out how although it was qualitative research, and although I was getting the responses from the participants themselves on what they believed they were learning, I talked about how using sociology, social psychology, talking about intersubjectivity and cognitive dissonance, all kinds of seminal jargon at this point, but ultimately, I argued that it creates a kind of worldview among Japanese students who go through this process, as well as the people who teach it. And it turns out that people who do this are actually very popular among employers. And the sacrifice, what appears to be a sacrifice to get into, what appears to be a sacrifice over the years, doesn't seem to hurt the students' chances at getting into a good university. And I spoke to people about this, various people about this. And so one of the things that students learn through this immense investment of time is discipline. And so, in fact, the students who are investing so much time in their sports clubs turn out to not be studying any less than the students who are not in sports clubs. They're spending less time at the convenience stores, they're spending less time at the arcades and the game centers. And so it turns out that the students seem to be gaining certain characteristics that are benefiting them in several ways, actually in many very important ways, and they're not at a disadvantage when it comes to the university entrance exams relative to their peers. And then let me see, a few years after I finished my Ph.D. dissertation, I got a grant from the Japanese government to do a large scale survey, a quantitative survey of high school seniors all across the country. So this allowed me to expand my qualitative study of high school baseball into a national study of close to 18 different high schools, every senior in the high school, and I got close to 4,000 respondents for a survey that had over 100 items on it. And then I was able to analyze that to point out that the qualitative study it actually was verified. It was found it was validated by the quantitative study. So not only were my findings valid, they were reliable, and they're representative of high school students who join extracurricular activities in general.
That must have been a fulfilling feeling if when the research became actually how do you say it, like confirmed.
Yeah, I guess there are different ways of looking at it, right? So remember, from an interpretive perspective or from a symbolic interactionist perspective, I don't want to use too much jargon, but the subjective understanding of reality is really all that matters. And so even the qualitative study was good enough for me, but I wanted to see actually whether or not what I found about baseball could be applied to other sports and other club activities. as well. And it turns out that the findings from baseball were very much replicated by findings studying other sports teams and many of the non-sports clubs, the cultural clubs.
Interesting.
So,
because, you know, there's
yeah.
different types of sports, right? Like when you play tennis, it's more of an individual sport compared to one where there's teamwork and collaboration in baseball. Do you think there's like a difference in findings between those kind of sports, or do you think it's applicable to all kinds?
Well, team sports did have a higher response, have a response rate that fit more closely with my findings from baseball. But there was one, but I think karate turned out to be relatively high, which is an individual sport, right? And then soccer was really low, so American football, right? Among team sports, it was the worst performing regarding learning character skills. And that has to do with the way that the culture of soccer in Japanese high schools is created, and the kinds of students who would join soccer, as well as the kinds of coaches who would coach soccer. In fact, Japanese students, high school students who are in soccer clubs are often criticized for having the worst manners among any school athletes. And I was speaking with a soccer coach, and he said they're embarrassed when he would take his soccer students, the students on the soccer team, to international events. The students on the soccer teams from other countries would be dressed up in a tie when they would come down for breakfast, and the Japanese students would be coming down in flip-flops and sweatpants. And he said, so he was asking me, well, you studied all these sports, so why is it this way? And I asked the coach, I said, tell me the truth. Weren't you like that when you were in high school? And he said, yeah. So there's a particular culture about the attraction to the types of students who are attracted to soccer might be already different. So there is a selection aspect, a self-selection aspect of what types of students are attracted to what types of sports. But the interesting finding, even more interesting than the soccer for me, was that the students on the brass bands, these large marching bands, those students perform very closely to the mean of sports clubs. And so I looked into that a little bit, and the culture around the marching bands is also very Spartan. It's very athletic in a sense that they run a lot. And I asked a student, think you run a lot? Well, this student told me that they ran more than the track team. And I asked her, why do you think you have to run more than the track team? She said, well, I think it's because we have to have strong lungs to play our instruments.
I mean, to a certain extent, it's true. I can't deny that for certain instruments. Like,
Well, I mean, these sports teams.
Long, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just saying, I mean, these are sports, so they have to be trained. I mean, if you take brass band and then you apply the sport kind of culture, the way of life to it, then I get it makes sense.
We have a question from the comments from Min, who asks, do you see any similarities between Japanese extracurricular activities between, comparing it to American extracurricular clubs? Is there a dynamic, do you think you've observed, that's different there?
American education system is much more diverse than the Japanese education system because we don't have a Ministry of Education. And we also don't, there are different sports conferences such as the NCAA and other conferences, but they're not as, universal within America, such as the way that the Japan High School Baseball Federation controls all of high school baseball. However, so I can't say, it's hard to generalize, but I can say that one of the big differences that I see is in America, American coaches and teachers also talk about the importance of character and sports as a character building activity. But that seems to be, people who talk about that are, generally speaking, much more likely to be giving it lip service and not really believing it. And the players themselves don't believe it, and the players themselves know that that it's kind of seen as a joke. So the players themselves recognize that sports in America is really, sports in American schools, generally speaking, is all about winning, and winning at any expense. And the fact that sports are not really seen as a part of education in America, they're seen more like entertainment or hobbies. And that fact is kind of obvious when you think about the no pass, no play rules that are very common in American schools. Whereas if you don't pass your classes, you can't play on the sports team, because the sports team is a kind of a reward for doing well in school. Whereas in Japan, there is no rule like that, because sports are also seen important as a part of education. So that's one big difference, that Americans who talk about sports being character building are much more likely to actually be skeptical about that, and they're not really trying to make them anything more than improving the skills of the game. That's a generalization, but there are some coaches in some schools who do take the character building aspect very important. And one thing that sociologists of sport in America have found is that female sports in schools seem to have many more benefits outside of the sports themselves for women who play on sports teams. For example, high school girls on sports teams are less likely to be I guess sexually promiscuous. They're less likely to be abusing drugs or alcohol. They're more likely to be working hard for their grades. They have higher self-esteem. They have more confidence than women in general, or high school girls in general. Whereas high school boys might have more confidence and more self-esteem, but they're also more likely to be abusing drugs or alcohol, and they're more likely to be sexually promiscuous and engage in sexual behavior that might be unsafe. So this is related to bigger arguments about masculinity and femininity, whereby women who participate in sports tend to gain more confidence than women who don't participate in sports, whereas because they don't need their confidence to come from their popularity among boys. But that's, again, I don't want to generalize too much about this field that I haven't studied myself in detail. But certainly when we talk about sports in the United States, sociology of sports in the United States over the past 20 years has really focused on gender in sports in the United States. Part of the reason is that sports are often seen as an effective way for men to prove their masculinity, whereas the gendered aspect of sports in Japan.
Oh, okay, now we're back, I think. Generally speaking, when I hear your research, I have to think, and maybe if it's the same for Buzz and Long, when I'm abroad, I have such a difficulty explaining people how important it is for Japanese to run through this kind of cohort community aspect in their lives, let it be through clubs, let it be starting in kindergarten. They kind of become, through these clubs, like baseball, like soccer, well, soccer maybe a bit less, part of the Japanese community. It's kind of a way for them to ensure that they're ready for their future life, it seems.
Or like they
am I right with saying that?
Or what you mean maybe is like they find their identity through the group rather.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I think what I would add to that is definitely they learn that what is expected of them is a total commitment to one thing. And so therefore, this kind of multitasking or or having different elements, focusing on different things is not something that is, or something that's less common in Japanese schools than, say, in American schools. Whereas Japanese students in middle school or in high school, most of them join clubs, and they're expected to devote everything to that club. So they'll spend hours every day in the club, and they're expected to have this single-minded devotion to the club, which does suit them later on if they enter corporations. And then it also suits, although many women don't necessarily want to be full-time stay-at-home housewives or mothers, surprisingly, in Japan, this is still a dominant norm, and therefore when women do become housewives or mothers, they put everything into it. And so there's this element of whatever your task is, that's what you got to focus on. And so I think that this kind of zealous or attachment to connection with or interaction with this one group or this one goal really does socialize them for a future whereby they'll also be expected to devote everything to that group or to that goal. So there, maybe 25 years ago, I heard one psychologist suggest actually that the Japanese high school students, although it might appear to be very stressful, Japanese high school students might have less role strain or role conflict, I guess, because they know what they're supposed to be focusing on. Whereas American students think, well, we got the SATs, we got the sports activities or the club activities that we're doing, we got a part-time job, we got to get a boyfriend or a girlfriend, all of these different expectations are on us. We have to be good students, and yet we still want to have fun. And so because there's too many different roles, or too many different roles within the idea of being an adolescent, that in a way could be putting more stress on American students. So I don't know if I believe that, but it's just one possible way to explain one of the possible outcomes of having a club or a goal. You don't have to think about other things, just do that.
I'm quite happy that we have this now on a live stream, because next time I try to explain it, I can just show this part of the video.
But I mean, talking about club, we can relate on this, right? Because when we first joined the music club in TIU, and I guess came in with a different expectation, right? We came in with a different expectation of what a club should be, and consequently, we're out of the club soon later.
Lon, you're bringing up a really important point. This is one of the difficulties with TIU and other Japanese universities that are trying to recruit more foreign students, is you come to the university and you can do your studies, but you want to interact with other students. And Japanese students, one of the most common ways to make friends quickly is to join a club. And so a lot of Japanese students will join the club that they had done in high school. Some of them will try a new club. But the point is, you join a club. But you saw in your own experience that the goal of the club is not necessarily to be the best at whatever activity that club is doing. It's really more to have a place, to have people to interact with, as well as certain expectations about how you interact with your seniors or with your juniors in the club. And so there's all of these expectations that the Japanese students might have about what it means to be on a club. When foreigners come in, they kind of disrupt that, and it can make it very difficult for foreigners to interact with Japanese students. But another important thing, so as I was just saying, the clubs are not just important to become the best at whatever that activity is, which is kind of different from the way I would say varsity teams in America would approach it. But they are really important to give students a place. I guess the Japanese word would be ibasho, or ba. And so the importance of having a ba is really, it's critical for all students. It was critical for you guys as well. And it was hard to find that for foreign students. I think that the Model UN Club has become an important place for many students at TIU. who otherwise would not have that kind of place, to interact, to improve on certain skills. But it's more than the content of what you're doing, right? And so if this is one thing that students, because before TIU I had worked at other Japanese universities, one of the biggest things that foreign students struggle with when they come to Japanese universities is interacting with Japanese students in clubs. It's because of the expectations associated with the clubs. The foreign students weren't socialized the same ways through their middle school and high school careers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is exactly how we actually experienced it in the past as well. I'd love to continue this conversation, but you also have done another research, actually, which we actually named the episode after. So this is the research you've done since the beginning of your PhD or dissertation, or as a professor, and now you've kind of developed it into something a bit different. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about your current research, what you're doing.
Yeah. Basically, my current research has less to do with Japan. It's about Japan because I'm here. But in social psychology, I think you guys all took social psychology, so you'll remember Zimbardo's prison experiments, right? Zimbardo's prison experiments are now, they're heavily criticized for ethical reasons and methodological reasons, and that's okay. I still teach that because it's important to know about this iconic study. However, I was teaching a social psychology class at another university in Tokyo in 2016, and we were talking about the Zimbardo prison experiment, and one of my students told me that she had visited a Japanese prison with one of her political science professors, and I got really curious. I wanted to know how I could apply the concepts of pathology of power and pathology of powerlessness to Japanese prisons. I wanted to see how relevant, I wanted to see whether Zimbardo's claims would hold up in Japan. And so I was introduced to this professor who has been working in Japanese prisons. She's also been a part of Amnesty International Japan for many years. And I went and spoke with her. And she told me that it would be very, very difficult, probably impossible for me to get in to visit with anybody in a Japanese prison. And so therefore, she didn't recommend that I pursue that. But she said, if you're interested in meeting people who are detained, there's this other institution called immigrant detention centers, where they detain foreigners who do not have the legal right to be in Japan. So visa overstayers, or people who have applied for asylum, been rejected, or people who have somehow had a visa but they lost it for some reason. By losing the visa was revoked. And so through her, I got in touch with an NGO that has been visiting foreigners who are in immigrant detention in Japan. And in December of 2016, I started visiting people in a detention center in Ibaraki Prefecture in Japan. So I've been visiting them regularly since December.
You bring up two very important terminologies here. I think that we should make clear before we continue, that is the prison and the detention center. Could you please explain it just briefly? What are the differences between the two? Because I think for a lot of people, they might mistakenly, recognize these two as the same term.
Right. They're very well. It's important to recognize the differences. So, prisons are places where people who have been arrested and convicted of crimes go. Right. Immigrant detention centers are only for foreigners who do not have legal residential status in Japan. The term, many people are familiar with the words illegal alien or illegal laborer, or in Japanese it would be fukudosha. But we prefer to not use the word illegal, because for many of the people who are in detention, the only crime that they have committed is overstaying their visa, or being in Japan without a legal status. So we prefer to use the term irregular migrants. In Japanese, that would be hiseiki taizaisha, so irregular residents. So most of the people who are in immigrant detention centers have basically been arrested by Japanese authorities and told that they're going to be deported, and they're supposed to be in the immigrant detention centers for a short period of time until they agree to return to their home countries. So they are not inmates and they are not prisoners, they are detainees. And so this is the language that we have to use when we refer to them. And there are many possible reasons as to why somebody might be arrested and put into an immigrant detention center. But one of them is that they could have come to Japan as an asylum seeker and been rejected, and therefore you can apply, you can appeal, but sometimes the Japanese authorities will just say, no, your rejection is clear, and they say you have to go back to your home country. Now, in the case of somebody who is legitimately afraid of being oppressed or harmed by going back to their country of origin, of course they will refuse to go back. And fortunately, Japan does not immediately deport or send people back to their countries of origin. But what they do is they put them in detention centers until they will agree to go back to their home countries. So asylum seekers are one type of person who might be put in a detention center. Another person could be somebody who, as I mentioned earlier, had a visa but had it revoked. Now, you can think of, one of the main ways that people will have their visas revoked would be, actually, before I get to the revoked visas, let me get to the overstayers. A lot of people come to Japan and overstay their visas. They come to Japan perhaps on tourist visas or through a visa waiver program where they're allowed to be in Japan for anywhere from 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and they can be in Japan without a visa for tourism and other purposes. But a lot of people overstay their visas, and in many cases it's because people come to Japan without a visa or with a visa that is too short, and they end up just staying. And there are many different reasons why they may overstay their visas. But those people also, when they're captured, when they're arrested, they are told that they have to be deported. And then there are people who had visas but had them revoked because of different things. For example, if you had a spousal visa and you got a divorce, or if you commit a crime in Japan, and if you commit a crime in Japan as a foreigner, first thing that happens is you are punished the same way a Japanese person is punished, so you have to go to prison. But the second thing that happens is you also lose your visa status. They say after you do your prison sentence, you're no longer welcome in this country, and therefore you have to leave the country. So those are the possible reasons as to why people might be detained. But why they would refuse to go back to their home country, there are also many reasons why they refuse. As I said earlier, for some people, they legitimately fear oppression or physical harm if they return to their home countries. These are people who should have been recognized as refugees, but were not. You guys probably know that Japan has probably the lowest refugee acceptance rate of any advanced industrialized nation. In 2017, there were 20,000 applicants and only 20 received asylum. Yeah. So that's 0.1%. In 2018, it jumped 400-fold. It went from 0.1% to 0.4%. So we're still talking about a very, very small number of people who are accepted in Japan. However, before we talk about this, when we talk about this, it's important to remember that from the Japanese authorities' perspective, it's not just that the Japanese immigration authorities are heartless. From the Japanese authorities' perspective, they argue that most of the people who are applying for refugee in Japan are not from countries that are producing refugees. So, for example, the three of the highest nationalities of the three top asylum seekers in Japan who come and apply for asylum in Japan are the Philippines, Nepal, and Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And now, Vietnam, it was much easier back in the 60s and 70s to accept Vietnamese as refugees because there was a war going on. But Japanese people today say, well, Vietnam has one of the fastest growing economies in the world right now. Vietnam is doing really good, so how can you be a refugee, right? The other two countries, the Philippines, there are some very bad spots in the Philippines, but generally speaking, it's not seen as a refugee-producing region from the Japanese perspective. In fact, many of the NGOs, some of the people that I work with, also cite this as creating trouble for people who might be legitimately seeking asylum. That when so many people who are applying for asylum in Japan don't fit the category, according to Japanese authorities, that kind of swamps the system for people who might actually be fearing for their lives, fearing oppression. And one of the ways to think about this is to remember that 10 years ago, Japan had maybe 1,000 asylum seekers. Or right? But 2017, there were 20,000. So the number of asylum seekers in those 10 years or whatever went from 1,000 to 20,000. But I guarantee you that the number of people processing these cases in the Ministry of Justice did not increase 20-fold. So they have to go through a lot more applications. They have to make, so it's messed up. Having said that, we should also recognize that Japan has one of the strictest interpretations of the definition of refugee in the world. In places like Canada, you just have to demonstrate that you in the past have been oppressed or persecuted, and that's enough. In places in Japan, you have to demonstrate that you will be, without any doubt, you will be oppressed or persecuted if you go back to your home country. And that's difficult to prove. You kind of have to how can you prove that something will happen?
Mm-hmm.
That makes it very, very difficult to. So there's a combination of things. They're getting a lot of applications from countries that they don't recognize as producing refugees, but they also do have one of the strictest interpretations of what it means, what is a refugee. And so these things are kind of working together to create a very low percentage rate of acceptance. But that's just one reason why you might not want. I'm sorry.
No, by all means, go ahead.
We have to end at 7. So there are legitimate asylum seekers who are afraid to go back to their home countries. So they'll be in detention. Then there are people who don't want to go back to their home countries. They don't fear persecution. They don't fear oppression. But the most common response that I get when I'm talking with people who are in detention is they have family here. Mm-hmm. Now, right, so Japan might want workers or they want students, but it's people who come. And people said they get married, they have children. I have visited men in detention who have been here since the 90s, been in Japan since the 90s, and then they got caught committing a crime, right? If you've been in Japan for 30 years and you get caught committing a crime, you still lose your visa status. Right? And so, but they have children. They don't want to leave their children. And so families, another reason that people want to go to their home countries or their countries of origin. I'd say families are probably the biggest reason that I've gotten, but I've also gotten reasons such as people who have debt back in their home countries. And if you think about the difference in how much money they could make if they could stay in Japan, even if they're working illegally, if they go back to their home countries, their families, their villages, it's going to cause a lot of trouble for a lot of people back in their home countries. So they just kind of wait. Now, it's important to point out that the people who are in detention are basically in a state of waiting. And what they're waiting for is provisional release. It's like probation, but it's basically they can apply for, they apply for provisional release. And it usually takes 2 to 3 months to get an answer. And up until 2015, 2016, it was quite common for people to get provisional release. And what that means is they'll be allowed out of detention. And there are certain rules about provisional release, but one of the rules is that, well, you have to come back to immigration authorities every month or every 2 months or every 3 months to renew your application for provisional release to allow you to stay out of detention. And so all of the asylum seekers and the people who might have family in Japan or have debt back home, they go into detention, refuse to be repatriated, all with the hope that eventually they'll get out of detention and be able to live their lives again. So that was up until 2015, 2016. It was very common for people to get provisional release. But when I started visiting in December of 2016, so for 3 years, from December 2016 to December of 2019, visiting fairly regularly, I only met, in 3 years, I only met 2 or 3 people who actually were successful at getting out on provisional release. Okay. And this is what the choka, so the lengthening of detention periods, we don't call them sentences, but they're the period of time with which people are being detained has been increasing. And so that has led to, as you guys, I think Buzz, you sent me an article about the hunger strikes in the detention centers. So maybe at this point
it's happened multiple times, right? Like throughout the past few years. It's not a new phenomenon, is it?
No, but the past couple of years, especially in the long-term detention centers, the hunger strikes have increased in number and severity, with one man from Nigeria actually dying of starvation. He starved himself to death last year. And then last year, at one point, there were more than 100 people who were participating in the hunger strike. It's largely in protest of this indefinite detention is what it was. So the Japanese authorities could say to the detainees, you can get out of here anytime you want. All you have to do is agree to go back to your country of origin. And so there, as I said, there are many reasons people could not agree to go back to the country of origin.
Yeah.
And so being indefinitely detained, you can imagine it's extremely stressful, but it's not just the lack of clarity about if or when you'll ever be able to get out. And with the see the people who are in detention are being released less and less often, that creates this idea of I might be here until I die, right? And in which case that leads to the only form of protest that I have is to harm myself by not eating. And so there were more than 100 people doing the hunger strikes last year. But it's not just the lack of clarity regarding the period of detention. Other things about being in detention are also psychologically very difficult for detainees. One of which is the fact that they are locked in small rooms 18 and a half hours a day. So they're only allowed out of their cells. I call them cells because they're basically the same as cells. You know, they have bars on the doors. They get their food through the door. They're locked in these small cells with other men, or if they're women, with other women who might or might not be from the same region of the world that they're from. They might or might not speak the same language. Most of the time they don't. So their mutual language of communication is Japanese for most of the people. But anyway, they're locked in these small rooms that have windows, but the windows are frosted. So sunlight can come in, but you can't see out.
Yeah.
And that is incredibly psychologically taxing to not be able to see out for 18 and a half hours a day. You're allowed out for 5.5 hours to do your laundry, to take a shower, things like that. But so indefinite detention, the situation of being detained, the food is, it's food that comes in on a styrofoam tray. I've had, no matter how big you are or small you are, you get the same portions. So I met a man, probably he's maybe 2 meters tall, an Iranian bodybuilder who complained that he wasn't getting enough calories because he's getting the same meal as the guy who's 140 pounds next to him, right? Another complaint is that their medical needs aren't treated. They complain about being given painkillers or basically sedatives, sleeping pills, no matter what they're suffering from. So they're not getting proper medical treatment. They're certainly not getting good psychological treatment. I know of, well, in addition to men who are starving themselves to death as a form of protest, I know of at least one man who has attempted suicide several times in detention. And so it's I can tell you, from the beginning of April until just this week, they were doing construction on my building. And as part of the construction in Japan, when they're doing construction on a building, they put up scaffolding around the building, and they put up nets so that they put up, basically it's kind of a net, kind of a curtain on the scaffolding. And even though I have windows and I have freedom to come and go, but because of coronavirus, we've been told to kind of cut back on getting out. So I've been in my apartment with freedom to come and go, but just not being able to see the sun, not being able to see the sunset, or not being able to see the sunrise, not being able to see the rain when it's raining. This is just incredibly stressful. And so my life has been more stressful just from that. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be locked in detention without knowing if or when I could ever get out. And so that led to the hunger strikes. And so then, okay, maybe I should pause now. See if
we have time.
we do have time. You know what? Thank you very much for this. Actually, I think this topic, it's safe to say it's rarely covered outside of Japan. I was talking to a lot of my friends here, and they all had no idea about how Japan approaches, the immigration issue. So what you're telling us about these centers is very interesting. But I just wanted to take the opportunity to interject and ask, what does the Japanese immigration agency, perceive as the solution to this issue? I mean, is it safe to say it's deportation? That's their main end goal here. And how many of the actual people who are detained, who get stuff like provisional release, how many of them actually hold criminal records, or how many of them actually break the rules when they're on provisional release? That's something I was thinking while you were speaking.
Right.
And maybe to add to that, sorry, kind of to Bell's first question, why is Japan so strict and so reluctant?
Well, so strict and reluctant, you mean regarding refugees?
Regarding letting people in, giving them asylum status, refugee status, treating them well in the detention centers. I mean, it's an industrialized country, as you said, so it's quite shocking for me to hear that a country like Japan would actually put, it sounds almost like prison to me, even though we have made the differentiation there. So I'm curious.
I should say that the detainees who I visited who have come from prison to the detention center have told me that it's worse than prison, because there are at least 3 reasons as to why it might be worse than prison. One, when you're in prison, you have a sentence. You know when you can get out. Psychologically, that takes an enormous burden off of you. 2 is, when you're in prison, you can see this as a form of slave labor, but when you're in prison, you have a job. You can work producing something. And if we think about human nature, human beings actually need to be productive. And when the coronavirus pandemic has created a lot of unemployment, right? But even people are getting very upset, very unhappy about being unemployed, not just because of the money. People need to feel like they're contributing or being productive, right? So in detention, though, there's nothing to do. They don't have anything to do. So they don't know when they're going to get out. They have nothing to do. And the third reason is most of the men who went to prison accepted that as a punishment for them breaking the rules. They recognized that they probably deserved it, the men that I've spoken with. So psychologically, that's also kind of like, it's my own fault. And so detention, however, is they just see it as being cruel. They don't understand why they're not being allowed out on provisional release. They don't understand why they're being forced to stay in detention forever. And they still don't want to go back to their home countries. Now, regarding the reasons as to why men, the reason I keep talking about men is because the long-term detention facility that I visit has been male-only facility for probably 4 or 5 years because they had difficulty keeping female guards. Japanese women didn't want to work at the facility, so now it's male-only. But anyway, as I said, you can apply for provisional release. It usually takes 2 to 3 months for the response. I have spoken to men who had applied more than 10 times, so now we're talking, they're into their second and third year. They keep applying, keep reapplying. When they are rejected, no reason is given. When they are granted provisional release, no reason is given. So nobody knows what to do to improve their chances of getting out. And so it's completely in the power and the discretion of the head of the detention center. And this also creates I would say this is where the pathology of powerlessness kind of kicks in. It leads to an enormous amount of frustration and lack of trust. Another problem is that the guards often tell the detainees that their attorneys are not really trying to help them. So many of the detainees hire attorneys to help them get out on provisional release. And when the attorneys are unsuccessful time and time again, the guards lie to the detainees saying, why do you keep paying so much money to that lawyer? They don't really care about you. They're working for the state. And so there's this enormous atmosphere of mistrust in the detention center that is really stressful. But let me say, okay, so now let's talk a little bit about for those who get provisional release. When they're granted provisional release, this is actually, some people are granted provisional release without ever being detained. In other words, sometimes the government says, okay, well, you really don't have the right to be here, but we're going to give you provisional release. And so that means they have to go to, sometimes, as I said, it's once a month. If you've been on provisional release for a year or so, and you show up every month to renew your application, and you haven't broken any rules, and then they'll renew your provisional release. And then after a couple of years, they might increase it to 3 months. So then you only have to go once every 3 months to renew provisional release. But the rules are really, if you're on provisional release in Japan, you have to register your address with the immigration authorities. And you can't move without getting permission in advance. And you can't leave the prefecture that you're residing in without getting permission in advance. And so you can't work, of course, because you don't have a legal residential status. So there's no working, there's no health insurance, there's no moving, and there's no leaving the prefecture. You can't own a cell phone, these sorts of things. I met a man from Pakistan who moved from the second floor of the building he was living in to the third floor of the building he was living in, and he was arrested for that. I met a man from Sri Lanka who spent a couple of nights at a friend's house when he was considering of moving, and when he went to renew his provisional release, He was arrested. The immigration authorities go and check. They went to his apartment to check. He was not there for a couple of days, and they said, "You have to be living here." And he said, "But I didn't leave Tokyo." He thought he just had to stay within the region. But it's not only that you have to stay within the region, you have to be living in the same place that you've registered. I know of a man from Turkey who is residing in Saitama, and he was driving a car from one place in Saitama to another place in Saitama that happened to go through a part of Tokyo. He happened to be going through a part of Tokyo, and he got into a traffic accident. It was a minor traffic accident, but because it showed in the report that he was in Tokyo without permission, he was arrested. And these are people who were arrested and put in detention for years. I know a man from Iran, another man from Iran who was working in a factory, and he, every month or every 3 months, he would go to immigration authorities, and the immigration authorities would say, "You're not working, right?" And they would all say, "Of course we're working. How are we going to survive without working?" So they're working in the black market. It's an open secret. It's a tatemae honne thing, right? Thinking about dual codes, right? Hopefully your Bento Bureau listeners will understand tatemae honne. But basically, the man from Iran had told immigration authorities every time he went to renew provisional release that he was working. And they would just say, "Don't work, you're not supposed to work, those are the rules." But one day there was an accident at the factory, and he got injured. And in order to get compensated, they had to file about the accident. And so then the next time he went to renew his provisional release, they arrested him. And then he was in detention for more than 3 years when I was talking to him. So these rules, I come to conclude that one of the ways that I think that the Japanese immigration authorities are operating under is this idea of plausible deniability. And I think that as long as they can deny that they know that people are breaking the rules, they don't really care. But once there's a paper trail, including insurance or including traffic accident or immigrants, the authorities go and they find out that the person is moved or is not there, then they have to act according to the rules. So it's really provisional release is not being detained, but it's not an easy life either. And in fact, regarding the number of people who have been detained, and we talked a little bit about the hunger strikes. Since the beginning of April, because of coronavirus and because of the Japanese authorities' fears about spreading in detention centers, they started releasing people in numbers like I've never seen before. So the detention center that I visited in Ibaraki had about 300, and I believe more than half of them have been released since the beginning of April on provisional release.
And where did they go?
Well, they have to go to the address that they've registered with the immigration authorities before they are released. However, I believe that many of them are just disappearing in Japan at this point. I don't mean that they're dying, but I think that they're hiding. They're not going to go because they don't trust immigration authorities anymore, because they don't have the same hope that they will be able to get out on provisional release. Ultimately, I think that they're getting out on provisional release and then hiding, and they're taking their chances. I know of several people. I know of a man from Iran and a man from Ethiopia who were released after the hunger strike last fall, and they didn't show up to renew their provisional release because they've lost complete trust in they don't have any hope. They think if I'm locked up again, I'm not getting out, and so they're taking their chances. But okay. I have to be honest. I don't know what percent are running away and what percent are actually I was speaking with a lawyer, and I was also speaking with somebody from the UNHCR back in December when we were talking about the men from the hunger strikes getting out and disappearing. And maybe let's just say the lawyer told me that it's not surprising that the men are just going into hiding. So people are not surprised because they know the conditions are so bad. So you asked, why is Japan so rigid or so difficult for people to... I think it's because Japan did not have a huge need for labor as soon as many European economies did, right? And so in the 70s and 80s, when many European countries started opening up to greater immigration, there were a few, there was a lot of news in Japan about how greater immigration into these societies was causing a lot of problems. Even though it wasn't really causing a lot of problems, the news was kind of creating a moral panic among Japanese policymakers. And so the idea is that Japanese policymakers have come to believe from that period that allowing more immigration is never a good thing. They see it as leading to higher crime and greater social instability. And so there's this fear, even though we know that immigrants tend to actually commit fewer crimes than native-born populations because they have kind of a dual penalty if they're afraid of losing the ability to stay in the country where they are. So generally speaking, immigrants have lower crime rates than native-born populations, but that is not an idea that has taken hold among Japanese policymakers. And so the Ministry of Justice in Japan, which has been the ministry in charge of immigration matters, is relatively conservative. There are other ministries in Japan that would have a more natural interest in increasing immigration, including the economy and trade and industry. Clearly wants more foreigners to come into Japan because the economy is struggling because of a lack of workers. But they have never had they've never had leadership really push for it enough. So I think that even though Japan recognizes, because of the low childbirth rate and the aging society, they recognize that they need more laborers, but they're trying to handle the population issues similar to the way I think Gulf states have tried to handle it, where they'll take in short-term workers, unskilled workers for short-term, and make sure that they're not allowed to renew and stay. And so they want to keep it a closed-door policy. But back to what I was saying earlier, I think it was Max Frisch who said, we asked for workers and we got people instead, right? So when people come to Japan and work, if they fall in love with somebody and have children or whatever, there's going to be this need for these people to stay in Japan, right? And so, but I think that still right now, Japanese policymakers, generally speaking, are trying to maintain control over the foreigners who come to Japan. And there are certain foreigners that they find desirable to stay long term, and those would tend to be the highly educated people like me with Ph.D.s and teaching. But the unskilled laborers, who are the ones that the economy really needs, Japan wants to make sure that they don't create any pathways for them to stay long term. So Japan is not unique in this sense. As I said earlier, I think they're modeling it really on the model of Saudi Arabia or even Qatar. This idea that let's bring in laborers for short term, but we'll control them and make sure they leave at the end of their period. So,
what about the cultural reasons, if there is a thing like that? Because we have a question from the chat. One member of our audience asked the question that do you think that this view of the immigrants from Japan reflects a collective identity of a monolithic or superior national racial identity? And she also quote a paper to include in this question. What do you think?
There is a fear about culture being somehow watered down, right? And so this is a fear that Japan shares with many other societies, that if we allow too many immigrants in, then Japan will fundamentally change, and we don't want an immigrant society. We want Japanese. We want to protect Japanese culture, and so this idea of Japan being homogenous, or one of the main themes of my Japanese society culture is to interrogate and challenge that whole notion of homogeneity of Japanese society. But let's assume that most Japanese people think that that Japan is homogenous, and therefore bringing in more diversity might seem threatening. Let me just point out that I'm not trying to in any way say that Japanese people are necessarily racist or prejudiced against foreigners. I think that the Ministry of Justice tends to have conservative views, and but I also think that most Japanese people. I don't know if you remember from Japanese society class, I had you read a paper written by Tsuda Takeyuki, who talked about how Japanese perceptions of foreigners sometimes is due to prejudice, which is prejudging. But sometimes it's due to behavior, which is breaking Japanese norms of behavior. In which case, that's not prejudging, that's judging the foreigners according to the same standard that they would judge other Japanese people. The problem is that if you think about when we attribute behavior to people, we will choose what is different about them. Why is somebody doing that? Why are they breaking the rules? Well, the first thing that we think about is, well, what is it about them that is different from us? So seeing somebody breaking the Japanese rules might create this idea that, well, non-Japanese people don't follow the rules, right? So it's not a static picture. We need to think about a dynamic, or about a process as opposed to a one-time thing. And so that does create more prejudice. But at the same time, positive interactions with foreigners might help decrease the prejudice. There's different theories about this, but clearly I think that for some Japanese people, it is not an economic argument. For some Japanese people, it is a cultural argument, and for some Japanese people, you guys remember human beings like predictability, right? And so for Japanese people, if they believe that whether it's prejudging or whether it's due to experience, that foreigners don't behave in the ways that they might consider to be predictable, that makes them uncomfortable, right? And so this is not a uniquely Japanese thing. It's just the way that it's played out in Japan is different from the way it might be played out in other societies. I'm really curious about how other societies that are similarly, again, I interrogate the notion of whether or not Japan is homogenous, but similarly ethnically homogenous countries like South Korea or Finland, how they would interact or how they would react to a lot of people who look different from them, who speak a different language, who wear different clothes, who, people tend to become uncomfortable in that sort of environment. Another thing I should point out, that this is really, really important, and I don't remember anybody else having said this, is a lot of unskilled laborers who come to Japan are going to be learning Japanese language and Japanese customs from unskilled Japanese laborers, right? Which would mean Japanese people with less education, Japanese people who might, for some reason or another, have been alienated from the education system or the employment system. They might have grown up poor. So they'll have different linguistic habits than the Japanese elite would have. And so they're learning how to speak Japanese and they're learning rough language. They're learning guttural language. They're seeing their coworkers when they're taking a break from the construction site that they're working at, because a lot of them are working doing demolition jobs. It's the 3K, the Sanke, so the dirty, dangerous, and what's the third D? Dirty,
dangerous, dirty, and
difficult.
Mizukashi. Okay.
Yeah. These are the jobs that Japanese people don't want to do. So the foreigners who are in Japan doing those jobs are learning kind of, and so when the people on the construction site, they're all, they're wearing these dirty clothes, they're taking a break, and they're smoking cigarettes and they're drinking canned coffee that they got from the convenience store, right? They're sitting on the ground. So then when I go and visit an area that I know has a high proportion of foreigners, and I see them sitting on the ground outside the 7-Eleven at 8 p.m., that's something that most Japanese people most Japanese people would consider to be kind of, it's unpredictable in a sense, but it's also considered low class. So as Tsuda pointed out when he was looking at Nikkei Brazilians in Japan, a lot of the Nikkei Brazilians were looked at as already, they were looked down upon because of the occupations that they were involved with, right? So there are many, many different variables as to why Japanese people might feel intimidated or nervous or otherwise not want a greater influx of foreigners. But a lot of it also has to do with media that comes in from America and from Europe about immigrants there. And even we have, among nationalists or patriots in European and North American societies, there are also a lot of people who want to get rid of the immigrant populations. So this sort of media this media narrative will reach Japan, and it creates a situation where the Ministry of Justice, the guards who work at the Ministry of Justice don't see themselves as sadists or as evil people. They see themselves as protecting Japan. Right? The Ministry of the immigration authorities, they see themselves as protecting Japan's borders. And so it's not, it's a complicated issue, but I think I guess maybe I don't want to draw a conclusion just now. It is a complicated issue.
Professor, thanks so much for that. Buzz, what do you think? We have spoken quite a lot. Shall we wrap this up? I think we could continue this discussion for a couple of hours more.
Yes. First of all, there is a lot more since January that is published. There's a lot more published in Japanese newspapers and in Japanese on the internet. But even in English, there is information out there. It's just hard to find. And so, in fact, TIU students have been working very hard since last December to set up an English language web page, but we're now going to make it a bilingual web page that will kind of gather information about what's happening with people in detention, what's happening with irregular migrants in general, and what's happening with asylum seekers, the situation of asylum seekers in Japan. So this web page is to raise awareness about these issues basically anywhere in the world. And the address is kasumiforrefugees.org. So it's KASUMI number 4 refugees dot, is it org or com? Let me see. Somebody Google it right now. Share the link in the Bento Bureau later. I should know this. Or, okay.
It shall be done. It shall be
Yes.
done.
So what happened was last November, I visited the detention center. It was November or December. I think it was December. I visited the detention center, and I visited men who had been on a hunger strike for some time, and they were quite emaciated. And one really struck me, and I couldn't get him out of my mind. He was so weak from not eating or drinking. He was only taking a little bit amount of water every day for several weeks that he couldn't raise his head to look at me. And I was so shocked by him because I knew that he used to be an athlete back in his home country. He was actually a very, very highly ranked Greco-Roman wrestler. And so he had the cauliflower ears, he was, and if you know wrestling, they tend to be they pride themselves on the grind and how tough they are. So here's a guy who was at least 10 years younger than me, who was emaciated and couldn't lift his head to look at me. And so I was talking in my global sociology class the next day it was 2 days later, about this person, and the students said, "What can we do to help?" And so we kind of had a brainstorming session in class, and I can't remember whose idea it was. I wish I could. But one student suggested that we create a web page to raise awareness about the issue. And so I went back to America for a couple of months. COVID happened. There was not very much progress until I got back here in Japan. And but then on June 20th, I believe, which is International Refugee Day, the students launched the webpage, and they're posting original contents and translations of information that we're getting from other websites with permission. And so if you go to kasumiforrefugees.org, you can see some of what we've started to do. It's still not in full swing, but we're working on it. So that's one more way to get information. We will be posting not only original information, but we'll be posting links to articles that are coming out in English and Japanese, so you can kind of keep up with what's in the media today about the situation of irregular migrants in Japan. So now to update you regarding coronavirus or COVID, as I mentioned, the Japanese government decided to start releasing men en masse since about April. And so right now it's really difficult for me to know how many people are still in detention, but as of probably a year ago, there was more than 1,000 people. I wouldn't be surprised if it's down to half that at this point. So, but I don't know. And because I don't know who has been released, and because that's information that I don't have access to, it's private information, I'll have to go to the detention center again and meet with people to find out who's in and who's out, but that's a one-by-one interview problem. But let me remind you that being in detention is horrible, but being released is also horrible, because you're not supposed to work. You're not allowed to leave the prefecture. You don't have health insurance. If you're in detention and you get sick, whether it's COVID or anything else, actually being in detention, because they'll probably just give you painkillers anyway. But being out now you're at risk of getting coronavirus, getting COVID, but you don't have insurance, and you're not allowed to work, so you don't have a lot of money. So what you have to do is, but people do get sick, they do go to the hospitals, and they end up paying the full price for treatment. So it's I don't know what's happening. I do intend next Saturday, I do intend to go visit an area where I know that there are many Turkish Kurds who have been seeking asylum in Japan since the mid-90s. And I'm going to visit a Japanese language classroom that our TIU students have been volunteering at to teach the Turkish Kurdish children Japanese. This is just another aspect that we haven't spoken about much, but children in Japan who don't have legal residential status still have legal right to public education, because the obligation to educate children is an obligation that the children have to go to school, but also an obligation that the government has to educate children. And it doesn't distinguish, in the Constitution, it doesn't distinguish between resident status. So the children are going to school, and the children are learning Japanese, and they get their homework and things like that, but the parents don't speak or read or write Japanese. If the father learns Japanese from work, that's okay, but he can speak Japanese, but he probably can't read or write Japanese. So children go home with homework, and nobody can help them with their homework. So on Saturdays, there's a Japanese woman who has been running a classroom to help children with their homework for a couple of years now. And we have a number of TIU Japanese students who have been volunteering there. Through I met this woman. I introduced another Japanese teacher in the J track, a teacher of psychology. She invited some of her students, and so we started that project as well. So on Saturday, when I go to this section of Saitama, I'm going to ask around to find out who's out and who's not out, and that sort of stuff. But right now, I think that probably half. It's a total wild guess, but of the long-term detention center in Ibaraki, it seems like more than half have been released. Another rumor I've heard about the detention center in Tokyo is that they've been letting people out, not on provisional release, but making them sign a contract that says that they will agree to return to their home countries as soon as flights are available. So people have become terrified of getting coronavirus in detention, so they want to get out. So they're more desperate, and they've been agreeing to go back to their home countries as soon as flights are available. So I imagine, this is just a rumor I heard from another scholar who has been working with them. I imagine that probably many of those people might just also disappear somewhere in Japan, but I don't know. Okay.
Well, we look forward to sharing that website and some of those resources with our community professor. Definitely keep us updated on what you learn in the coming weeks, and perhaps we'll come back to revisit this subject with some of the other contributors of the project sometime in the future. But Professor, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And a big thank you to everyone that tuned in. Don't forget to like and follow Bento Bureau on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and YouTube, of course, where we're streaming right now. And feel free to let us know your thoughts and suggestions by sending us a message or leaving a comment. Professor, is there anything you'd like to share before we conclude this episode? Any thoughts or stories you'd like to share with the audience? This seems to be a recurring issue where each guest just is taken off guard and they're not sure what to share on the end of it.
Okay, everybody stay safe, wear a mask, keep away from other people. Let's get through this. Don't be like America. I saw that Trump, President Trump, was wearing a mask the other day, and now all of a sudden he says he's always liked masks. So I guess that's.
I was seeing some funny things on Twitter where they were drawing parallels of people, Trump supporters in general, where they take some of their older tweets where they're totally anti-mask, but then when they saw that picture, that nicely taken photo of him wearing the black mask, they're all like, that's so badass, where do I get that mask?
Right. No, as you know, let's not draw, let's not essentialize about Trump supporters. People supported him for many different reasons, so I don't want to get into that. But yeah, I'm discouraged by the fact that it has taken America so long for finally some states are starting to give a mandate for people to wear masks. But I continue to be discouraged by the fact that some people continue to see it as a political decision as opposed to a health decision. This is all very fascinating from a sociological perspective, very depressing from a human perspective. But my family is still in America, so I'm kind of terrified that even though the state that my family is in Massachusetts, and even though they seem to have slowed down the spread quite a bit, they seem to be doing well with controlling it in Massachusetts. Unless you control it everywhere, you don't control it anywhere. And so it's really discouraging for me to see people in Texas and Florida and these kind of people who are resolving their cognitive about voting for Trump by continuing to support everything that he says. It's discouraging. But let's end on a positive note. What's something positive? What's good? Oh, okay. Here's the good note. The good note. All right. They've taken scaffolding. I can see out my window. I can see the sunset. I can hang my laundry out on my veranda now for the first time in 6 weeks. So that's good. It's that's probably the best thing. The thing I'm most excited about right now is that I can see out my window. So everybody, if you can look out your window and if you can see the sun, appreciate your life, because a lot of people can't do that, and it's terrifying.
Definitely.
So let's all be thankful that we can see the sky, we can see the sun. We can go outside and feel the rain. And so as long as we wear a mask and don't get too close to other people, we've still got a relative amount of freedom. Let's be thankful for that. There, I was able to spin it into something positive.
Love it.
I appreciate you sharing that piece of humble pie, Professor. I think we all need to keep that in mind, in such dire times. I started the episode by talking about how bleak it is, but it's not so bad when you come to think about it. Anyways, thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and if you enjoyed this, please like the stream and subscribe for more talks like this. Have a lovely Saturday, everyone. This is Bento Bureau signing off.